You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with Conservative Home's Deputy Editor, Henry Hill, who's here with me in the studio. And joining us down the line is the Daily Mirror columnist, Susie Boniface. They'll both be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. The Daily Express reacts to the by-election results with a quote from the Prime Minister, Rishi. All isn't lost. Next election, not done deal. And go true blue or face wipeout, reads the Daily Mail, as it too leads on Rishi Sunak's response to the Tory by-election defeats. The Financial Times too leads with advice given to the Prime Minister by Tory MPs. The headline, Tories urge Sunak to rein in green pledges after by-election carnage. And this same sentiment is on the front of the Daily Telegraph. PM urged by Cabinet to abandon eco-policy. Sunak aims to divide and rule after poll setback, reads the front of the Times, as it also leads on the same story. And the front of the Eye Weekend is less optimistic for Conservatives, with the headline, Tories fear wipeout, with 150 MPs now facing axe. And shattering defeats for Tories in cry for change, reads the front of The Guardian, as they too lead on this story. In some other news, the captain of the Lionesses, Millie Bright, is pictured on the front of the Daily Mirror as they try to bring home the World Cup. And hellhole, reads the front of The Sun, as it looks at the queues of people trying to get away for the summer season. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by Susie Boniface and Henry Hill. Welcome to you both, Henry, in person.
Hi.
Lovely to meet you
and
for the first time.
Yeah.
In the flesh.
Yeah.
Let's start off with the Times. And they're really suggesting that the Prime Minister is going to be looking at new strategies to prevent the losses that we've seen in the by-elections and moving forward. Henry, take us into their particular stories, saying that he's going to aim to divide and rule. How so?
Basically, the lesson that the Tories are trying to take from Uxbridge is that the way to beat Labour is to find individual wedge issues where they can put themselves on the right side. Because they've been in power for a long time, Labour are 20 points ahead in the polls. There's a general sense, I think, that a lot of voters want change. And so instead of trying to fix the whole thing, they find individual policies where Labour can be on the wrong side of public opinion and go really hard on those. That's why the Prime Minister is talking about doubling down on small boats and channel crossings. Maybe there will be other elements of the green agenda, as we've seen suggested in some of the other papers. We don't yet know what form this will take, but it suggests that as Labour firm up their policy offer, the Tories are going to be looking for ways to put themselves on the right side of the argument on that. So
to have some clear water between themselves and Labour, in essence?
Yeah, absolutely.
Susie, your thoughts are on that. I mean, one of the areas, as mentioned by Henry, that perhaps might be the green credentials and plans afoot in that respect.
Possibly, but I mean, you know, part of the reason we have a lot of green issues on the table at the moment is remember that people's back gardens actually caught fire last year. And other people's living rooms have been underwater for winter after winter. It's not like there's a load of green issues floating around and people don't care about it. All the polls show people really do care about environmental issues and they do want to fix some of these things. There's been a massive failure of communications, particularly around ULEZ and air pollution. For example, busy talking about how we're going to take allowing the Tories to talk about a tax on driving or taking your car away from you and not communicating the fact that, for example, air pollution is attributable for 20% of strokes, that it's been found in the brains of Alzheimer's patients, that it gives you cancer, that it affects children. You know, are you really suggesting, the Conservative Party or indeed anybody else, that you want children to have more asthma attacks or you want people to have more strokes and more cancer? Because that's obviously where you end up with it.
Well, nobody wants that, but I mean, Sir Keir Starmer himself.
Well, exactly, but that's the thing. You've got people suggesting let's have some green policies because the world's literally on fire and people are dying, and then someone else is going, we don't want those, no, because that's expensive. So let's just not do it. There isn't really any kind of happy way in between, and it's not being communicated or sold very well to voters, which is why you had this problem in Uxbridge. But what is being suggested here in the Times is basically just being as divisive as possible, by finding every dog whistle that you can and blowing it. Now, that might work in one or two places. It might work in Dover to go on the small boats issue. It might have worked in Uxbridge to go on ULEZ. And there might be places where you can get enough people out to the ballot box because you've had a row about trans rights for some reason. But the people who are going to be aerated by these things are spread out across the country. They are not all in one place. And you are not going to find a really divisive wedge issue like that in 600 odd seats. It's not going to work on a large scale. So what this shows, if this is correct, is that the Tory party are thinking on a very small scale. They're thinking about winning a seat here or there that they might otherwise have lost, and thinking that it might come down to, you know, single figure seats in terms of who's perhaps running the government, or perhaps how much they can actually claw back if they get wiped out at the election.
Henry, what do you think to that analysis? I mean, will it boil down to the fact that ULEZ has not been particularly popular with some voters?
Yeah, so ULEZ is a strong issue for the Tories because the Tories are much stronger in outer London. The expansion of ULEZ to outer London is not car dependent, so they've clearly identified that. But there aren't that many places you can do that. It's good news for the Welsh Tories, where they can run against an incumbent Labour government. Maybe the Scottish Tories can run against SNP failures. But in most of the country, there's just the Conservative government and the country. So there won't be that many issues like this where they can do a hyper-local campaign. So what Rishi Sunak seems to be trying to do is find national issues where the Tories can maybe do what they did in '92, which is not so much run on their own record as run against what Labour, or what they said Labour were proposing to do.
Let's move on to the Eye, and this is a much more pessimistic take, perhaps not surprisingly. They're saying that the Conservatives could lose 150 MPs. They're suggesting they're facing the axe. That's their prediction. Susie.
Yeah, and that's sort of as you take the 20-point swing, which is the average over the three by-elections, and compare that to Parliament, that's what you'd be facing, which is what it comes down to. The question of really, is Rishi Sunak, some of the Conservatives, especially the front benches when you've seen them out in the last 24 hours, seem to want to say, look, we can totally win the general election. But I think anyone with any common sense is thinking, you're probably not going to win the general election. Therefore, how can you retain as many seats as possible so that, you know, when there's 5 years down the line and another general election, or 10 years down, how quickly could you try to return to power? And that's really where the realistic and the realpolitik is how can you survive this? If they do lose 150, I mean, that is close to fatal. There's barely anything left. There'd only be a Tory rump left in the House of Commons. But you know, if it is going to be, as we've seen overnight, where Labour can win, say, the red wall back, and Lib Dems can win in the blue wall, and the Conservatives maybe can win here and there on some wedge issues and be divisive and get people to the polls that way. Interestingly, not because they like Rishi Sunak or his policies, but because they're upset about something else. Which is very much how you normally would fight it, as an opposition rather than as an incumbent government. But if they can get a few, then maybe we're looking at a minority government after the next election, and whoever, you know, is going to be the largest party in there we're going to have a period of instability, perhaps, where, you know, if Keir Starmer is leading the largest party, then has to go to the country again within a couple of years to try and get a better majority. But I'm not sure we'd actually lose 150 in one go.
Henry, if we've got Conservatives saying that they believe that's what's going to happen, that 150 MPs will lost, I mean, that indicates that they have no faith in their party or their leader.
I mean, even if they are sympathetic to Rishi Sunak, there's only so much he can do. You know, you think about the circumstances in which he came into the number 10 immediately after the Liz Truss chaos, after the Boris Johnson fiasco. Tories had tanked in the polls. He's not a magician. You can criticise elements of his strategy, but the Tories have been in power for 13 years and are 20 points behind, and there's not much scope he has really for turning that around. But absolutely, it does indicate that the Conservatives, at least many Conservatives, are now deeply pessimistic. And that's important because, as Susie says, a lot of this will depend on the strategy the Conservatives choose to take into the next election. There was a leak the other day that they were thinking of doing an 80-20 with 20 attack seats. That would be absolute madness in the face of the current polls. The Tories need to choose really carefully where they dig their trenches, where they defend, to make sure they try and come out of the next election as strong as possible so that they can be competitive in 5 years or 10 years' time.
The Mail's headline, go true blue or face wipeout. Perhaps I should ask Henry this question, but I'm going to ask Susie counterintuitively. What is true blue?
Well, according to the Daily Mail, it's tax cuts and abandoning green issues. And that really boils down to being more like Liz Truss. And that is a very bold ask, I think, of anyone or any government. The only person who's prepared to still do sort of some of Liz Truss's policies are Liz Truss and Liz Truss's cat. So I don't. It's a bit of a. It's a strange front page. And it's one of those things where the Tories have had a bad night. They were expecting a worse night. They thought they were going to lose Uxbridge. They haven't lost Uxbridge. They think that's some cause for optimism, and they're trying to find a way in which they can say, look, we can find a way through this. We just need to do X, and it'll all be fixed. And the unicorns will fly out of the sky. And maybe if we be more Tory, we'll cut taxes, that'll do it, won't it? And they seem to have forgotten. It wasn't even a year ago they tried cutting taxes and the whole economy got set on fire. Anyone who is seriously thinking that in the middle of what we've got at the moment, the right thing to do is to have some unfunded tax cuts and do it all again is living in cloud cuckoo land. And they certainly shouldn't be talking to any journalists because, well, the journalists shouldn't be paying them any attention either. They're obviously lunatics.
Well, Henry, these senior Tories talking to the Mail are saying that Rishi Sunak should cut taxes and build houses, and that will lure back the voters.
I mean, the presence of build houses is absolutely incredible. I'm messianic about building houses. I think it's one of the big things the Conservatives have missed. But the reason that the Conservatives keep failing to hit house building targets is because it's deeply unpopular with Conservative voters in the Blue Wall and other bits of the country. Everyone's in favour of housing in principle, but the moment it's housing near them,
yes,
then all of a sudden it's no, that's not suitable for our local area. So Theresa May managed to throw away the 2017 election because she proposed making asset-rich older people contribute something towards the cost of their social care. I think Rishi Sunak would do something similar if he went massive on housing, unless he was very careful about how he did it, because there's lots of Shire seats which might be flirting with the Liberal Democrats. If they thought they were going to get concreted over, then the Liberal Democrats would be all over that.
Interesting. We are going to take a break, both, but do stay with us. Coming up, Boris Johnson turns his fire on the boss of NatWest over the Nigel Farage controversy. We'll discuss that and more next. Do stay with us. You are watching the press preview. Still with me, Susie Boniface and Henry Hill. And we're going to start this section off by having a look at the Telegraph and a story regarding Boris Johnson. He's called on the chief executive of NatWest to resign if she's found to have leaked details of Nigel Farage's bank account to the BBC. Henry, what say you to that? Is it his place to be calling for resignations?
I mean, as a comment journalist, I suppose I have to defend the right of comment journalists to demand people's resignations. But if this chief executive had leaked private banking details to the press, that would be, I think, a fairly serious breach of some banking regulations. I don't think, though, that Boris has got any evidence that she has, which I think is a crucial sort of missing ingredient between an opinion piece and an actual story. This, of course, is down to the fact that Coutts closed Nigel Farage's bank accounts, and then there was conflicting stories about why they did that. He did a subject access request, and it turned out that it was because their reputation management committee decided he didn't align with their values. It's an important story in many respects. I think this is basically Boris Johnson trying to elbow in on it on the basis of some fairly slender allegations. If more evidence comes to light, that would be maybe significant, but there's no sign that he has any.
What do you mean elbow in on it?
It's a story that doesn't involve him, and he wants to sort of gee up the right, and it's a story that's mobilising the right. The idea of woke corporations shutting down people's bank accounts is something that is motivating the kind of Conservatives that form Boris Johnson's constituency today, and so therefore I think it's not surprising that he wants to weigh in and have something to say on it.
And Susie, he's calling for ministers to hold a leak inquiry into how the inaccurate story came to emerge.
Yeah, I don't know how on earth he would expect that to happen quite, because the government doesn't get to inquire into what a bank says to a journalist normally. That's between the bank and the journalist. And of course, the allegation is that the chief executive of the bank gave a reason to the BBC that for Nigel Farage's bank account being shut down, which turned out to be false. So if you want to say that she was leaking personal details, well, then she wasn't, if she did do that, because it was something that was false. But one of the lines in this column, is an absolute mad railing and a flight of fancy. It's talking about how this is about far more than the bank account of one person. This is about freedom under the law and the right of every British-born man to go and do and say what you believe. It's freedom of speech, blah, blah. Look, any business in this country is able to chuck people out. You can get thrown out of the chippy if the chippy thinks that you are putting people off coming into the chippy, or that you are somehow portraying an image of the chippy that isn't in the chippy's best interests. And unfortunately, what people do not seem to mention in this case is that Nigel Farage kept saying publicly that he had an account at Coutts. Had he kept his mouth shut and stopped boasting about it, he wouldn't have created any kind of reputational damage, which meant Coutts then had to put him on a regular risk review that they did annually, and that eventually found he was starting to cause a bit of a reputational problem for the bank. Now, if you want to say that the bank isn't allowed to eject Nigel Farage for having views they felt didn't align with theirs, number one, he's proved recently that he does have views that do not align with theirs. They are not in agreement about a lot of things. But then you also have to say, like, a pub landlord doesn't have a right to chuck someone out for bad behaviour, or that it doesn't have a right to say, do you know what, I just don't want to serve within the law. I'm not discriminating against you for a protected characteristic, but I don't want to serve you for some reason. I don't want you in my cab. I don't want you in my chippy. I don't want you in my paper shop. Everyone's got a right to do that as a business. I run a business. I'm a freelancer. I get to say, do you know what? I don't want to work with you, Sky. I find you obnoxious. I'm not going to work with you. And that's my right. No one can say you must do it. I have no choice in the matter. Being Nigel Farage is not a protected characteristic. He should have just kept his mouth shut and we wouldn't be in this situation.
But of course, obviously, you don't think that about Sky, just for the record.
Of course not, but
just very quickly, though, on this story, Henry, the quote from Boris Johnson is about freedom under the law. That freedom made our country great. It's under threat. It is time to fight. Do you agree with that sentiment?
I mean, no. Susie is right. As the law currently stands, businesses do have the right to do this. It was established in the famous so-called gay cake case, Asher's Bakery case, that businesses don't have to serve people that they disagree with. I think there's an argument, perhaps, to the extent that banks have a very privileged role in our system. They make an awful lot of money providing essential infrastructure, but no, in general, this is not all that worrying.
Henry, thank you.